You can also find her in the documentary Carl Laemmle about her Uncle Carl and his many accomplishments. And next week she'll be here again introducing Phantom of the Opera as I play the organ next Sunday. So, ladies and gentlemen, Antonia Carlotta.
Hi. How is everybody? And no, I do not get into Universal for free, usually, unfortunately. Hi, my name is Antonia Carlotta. I am the great-grandniece of Carl Laemmle and the creator and star of Universally Me on YouTube. I will not be offended if anybody takes out their phone right now to subscribe. Totally okay with me. And next slide. And I'm really excited tonight to talk to you all about Dracula. How many of you have seen Dracula before? Oh! Amazing, that's a lot of people. How many have not seen Dracula before? Woo! Oh my gosh, a lot of you. Okay, you guys are in for a really big treat tonight. It's a great movie. And I'm just really excited to share with you a little bit about Dracula, what makes it such an important movie, and like a little behind the scenes. So let's go to the next slide. Luckily, I had an amazing introduction, but why do I care so much about Universal and classic horror and Dracula? Because I'm a member of the Laemmle family. So my uncle Carl Laemmle, this guy all the way over here, he started Universal Studios back in 1912. He was a German immigrant. He moved to the United States as a teenager. He worked in a clothing business for many years. It wasn't until he was 39 years old he opened up his very first theater, not really on a whim, but like almost on a whim. He didn't really realize that this was going to be his future, but really quickly he got into distribution and then producing movies, and then he started Universal. So pretty amazing. A couple of his other accomplishments, just because there are so many. He also won a Supreme Court case against Thomas Edison, which really opened up the film business to become the amazing industry it is today. He invented the concept of the movie star and the movie studio tour, which is really awesome. And after he retired from the film business, he also sponsored hundreds of Jewish refugees to come to the United States and like save their lives. So he's an awesome dude. Thank you. His son, Junior Laemmle, grew up on the Universal Studios backlot. He produced hundreds of movies for Universal. We will talk more about him in a little bit. My Aunt Carla Laemmle, she was a dancer and an actress. You will see her in Dracula. She speaks the very opening lines of the movie. It starts like, among the rugged peaks, yada, yada, yada. You'll hear it. So she's amazing. Edward Laemmle was my great-grandfather. He produced like the first $1 million movie for Universal. Very cool. My uncle Ernst. He was a director. He directed some of Phantom of the Opera, which will be here next week. So this is why I care, and this is my family. And let's go to the next slide, where one of the big things, I guess I touched upon it, but my family made the Universal Monster movie. So kind of starting with Phantom of the Opera, that's the first one that a lot of people consider, but really hard launching with Dracula, which we'll be seeing tonight, and then moving on into all the other Universal monsters. And those were really spearheaded by Junior Laemmle. So next slide, please. Junior Laemmle. So he was raised on the Universal Studios backlot from the time that he was just a kid. He was sort of being primed by his dad to take over the business one day, sort of his family business. And he was really smart. So for his 21st birthday, as his present, he got to become head of production at Universal, which is like a pretty amazing present. And you know, he had earned it by that point. He had so much experience, and what really set him apart, or one of the things that set him apart from the other moguls, is he also had youth on his side, and he really had this sense of like what people wanted to see and what was coming up. Junior really wanted to get into horror. Horror was actually a new genre, so that like term as a genre didn't exist yet, but he wanted to make these scary movies and these supernatural scary movies. And his father was not so sure about them at first. Uncle Carl really wanted to make movies that were like Universal, hence the name of the studio. He wanted movies that would appeal to everybody, that everybody would want to see, just have the widest audience possible. And horror really had the possibility of like ostracizing whole audiences and turning people away, so it was a big risk. This was also during the Great Depression, when people weren't going to movies as much, and there was this prevailing idea that if people were going to movies, they wanted to see things that were like happy and fun. So it was really risky. But Junior felt really sure about it, and he really pushed for it, and he really wanted to make Dracula. Oh, and the other reason it was really risky, even just beyond regular horror, this was their first supernatural horror film. So every scary movie that they'd had before this, say The Cat and the Canary or The Phantom of the Opera, there was like a very earthly explanation for it. The author Julian David Stone, who was here yesterday, he calls it the Scooby-Doo reveal in the movies. But Dracula, there is no reveal. It's just true supernatural horror. So that's another reason it was risky. Next slide. So once Junior got his way, he's making Dracula. The next thing he has to do, he's got to cast his star. So of course we know Bela Lugosi got the role. But Bela Lugosi was so far from the first choice to play Dracula, he really had to fight for it. For a long time they wanted Lon Chaney to play Dracula, the Man of a Thousand Faces. He had done The Hunchback of Notre Dame, he'd done Phantom of the Opera. Unfortunately, he passed away before Dracula was made. And then they had a whole list of other people they wanted. I know Conrad Veidt was on the list, but Bela Lugosi had originated the role on stage, and he wanted to do it. He even took a big pay cut, and finally Universal agreed to let him play the role, which now we know, like, there's no other Dracula, but that was something he had to fight for. But I know, after the fact, he had a really hard time escaping Dracula. It, for lack of a better word, haunted him for the rest of his life because he couldn't escape Dracula and horror films and kind of get out of that space. Next slide. He was also cast alongside Helen Chandler, David Manners, Dwight Frye, and Edward Van Sloan. You might think that, like, this movie that now we know has lasted so long and stands the test of time, you might think that they knew they were working on something so special. But I know Helen Chandler and David Manners in particular, they thought it was pretty silly. Again, there weren't like a lot of supernatural horror films at the time. They thought it was sort of frivolous material. They weren't stoked about it. And Helen Chandler actually had appendicitis throughout the filming of this movie, and she was just waiting for it to wrap so that she could get surgery. But, you know, we know now it's a great movie. Next slide. And another thing that's very cool and very special about Dracula is it came out at the time that the industry was kind of in the in-between between the silent era and the sound era. And the industry was trying to navigate, well, what does that look like, especially when filming and marketing for international markets. Because with silent films, all you would have to do is like switch a few title cards and whatever, and that was fine. And you could send a movie around the world, no big deal. But suddenly with sound, it was different. So Dracula is one example of a film that has multi-language versions of the film. So every day, the cast that we know that we're gonna see today would come in and film their parts and do everything they're supposed to do. And every evening, a Spanish-speaking cast would come in. So that's Carlos Villarreal on the right. Lupita Tovar is the female lead in it. And it was directed by George Melford. And they would come in, same sets, many of the same costumes, props, all of that stuff. And they would film Spanish Dracula at night. And because they had the benefits of watching the dailies from our English-speaking Dracula during the day, some people do consider the Spanish Dracula to be technically the better version of Dracula. But nobody, of course, will ever be able to go see. Next slide. So, as I guess we probably know, Dracula was a huge success when it was released. I know that for Junior, it really made him feel like he had made the right choice, and he instantly started turning his attention to making more horror films. The next one on his slate was Frankenstein. Next slide. Yeah, and this really hard launch, the Universal monster. So it went right from Dracula to Frankenstein to The Mummy, The Invisible Man, The Bride of Frankenstein, The Werewolf of London, all of those. And horror became a genre that it, like, instead of being a shocker or a thriller or just a scary movie, it became horror movies. And all the studios started making horror movies. And between all the monsters, Universal did too, like The Black Cat and The Raven and all these other really cool movies. Next slide. And Bela Lugosi's Dracula is the Dracula that really laid the blueprint for like all vampires really that came after it. I would say it's like only recently that we see a lot of deviations from this traditional Dracula, this traditional vampire. So we've got here Renfield and Count Von Count and Hotel Transylvania. He really laid the blueprint, and that's, I don't know, very special, just a very huge deal. Next slide. And then the one final thing that I'll leave you guys with before we watch the movie, I want to turn our attention back to two special people, Bela Lugosi and Carla Laemmle. As I mentioned, obviously we've got our Dracula here, and she speaks the opening lines. Today, October 20th, is both of their birthdays. They would both absolutely love that this was on. Carla lived to be 104 years old. She just passed away in 2014. And she would come to all the events that she could to see stuff like this, and she loved to continue to be honored. So thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you all for having me. I'm so excited.